Good morning. Today we are continuing to learn about the early Dakota. Um, we are starting on page 42 because we did not get a chance to read about the Dakota Nation yesterday. So on page, before we start our reading, let's review our key terms. So our first one, Minnesota Makose. What does that mean, Maddie?
The lake's so clear that it reflects the sky.
Yeah, it's the land with the lake so clear, the water so clear that it reflects the sky. And it's where we got our state name, Minnesota. Our next one is teepee. What is a teepee, Cole?
It's a cone-shaped structure or house made structured by animal skin over wooden poles.
That's the cone-shaped structure that's made of stretched animal skin over the wooden frame. It's easy for them to take up and down, so they can undo their teepee in the morning, travel to their new campsite, and set it up for their evening. So they'll have it to sleep in the evening. So it's easy and portable. Generosity. What does generosity mean, Caitlin?
Isn't it that habit of giving somebody without expecting anything?
Yeah, it's giving without expecting anything in return. It was an important value to the early Dakota. It's an important value today in many cultures. Being generous, giving to others, knowing that God will take care of you. You give freely to others, and God will make sure that you are taken care of. So don't expect them to give back to you. Just know that you will always have what you truly need. God will provide for you. So give to others freely. Kinship. Leah. Yeah, it's that close relationships with your family members. Extended family. Izzy. Yeah, it's all of your family members, more than just your parents, your brothers, sisters. It's all of those family members. Income. Lily.
Money or benefits received.
Yeah, it's money or benefits received for the services that you do. So it could be your money, it could be somebody doing other things back for you, it could be giving you something in return for what you've done. Human capital. What is human capital, Maddie?
Skills you need to get income.
Yeah, it's the skills and knowledge that you need to get more income. So it's learning more to be better at what you're doing so you can get more income with it. Respect. This is probably my favorite one on here. What is respect? Leah? To honor somebody and treat them with consideration and courteous. To be courteous and considerate to others. Honoring them. You respect them. This was an important value for the early Dakota. It's an important value in every culture, even today. As a Catholic, we know we need to respect everyone. Treat everybody with dignity and respect. If we look at our Catholic social teachings, being respectful is important. So we need to remember to treat everyone with that respect, even if it's somebody we don't like, even if it's somebody who is very different from us. We treat everybody with respect. We don't make faces. We don't talk about people. We don't make jokes about people that will hurt feelings. Jokes can be hard. Okay? Some people don't find them funny. So let's not tease people. It's so easy to do, to just tease somebody and say something that you think is silly. Watch the reactions. When you say something that you think is silly or funny and the other person is not taking it the same way that you're saying it, you need to stop. Okay? Be respectful. Be careful of your jokes. It is not funny if it's mean. All right, let's look at our reading for today. On page 42, the Dakota Nation. Dakota kin lived all across the woods and plains which covered the land from St. Croix River west to the Rocky Mountains. The stories and customs of this large and diverse group differed from village to village. Dakota who lived in the north and east hunted game in the deep woods, harvested wild rice from marshes, and pulled fish from countless lakes and rivers. Those who lived in the south and the west were prairie people who followed the migrations of the revered buffalo. So sometimes they had to be able to move their camp wherever the buffalo were moving to. There were thousands upon thousands of buffaloes that were roaming around, and they would go to where the grass was. When they ate down the grass in one area, they'd move to a new area. So the Dakota had to be able to move with them. Though spread out across different landscapes, all Dakota groups considered themselves part of one large nation called the Dakota Oyate. Throughout this nation, some things stayed the same from year to year, such as the importance of kinship. Other things changed. Babies were born, people got older and died. New ways of doing things were discovered. Sometimes new people entered their lives. Some of these people came and went. Others, though, would bring changes that would forever alter the lives of the Dakota people. Just like today, new people enter your lives. They might become a fun new friend and be a close part of your life. They might be somebody that just comes and goes. You have a teammate that you're with just for one season. People come and go. Sometimes they bring positive changes, sometimes there's negative changes. So we're going to find out how the Dakota were affected by these changes, by these new people. Some things will be good, some things not so good. If we look at that picture, we can see just how big the area was for the Dakota. So on page 43, you can see that shape of Minnesota over on the right, and you can see Lake Superior on that far right. So we can see that in Minnesota was the Ojibwe Indians, and then there's also a large part of Minnesota that was covered by the Dakota. Over in Wisconsin, there's the Ho-Chunk. Up in Canada, we see the Cree and then Anishinaabe. Way far west, we see the Mandan. Down south is the Omaha and the Iowa. Omaha is a big city in Nebraska, named after the Omaha Indians. Iowa, the great state of Iowa, is named after the Iowa Indians. So a lot of these names come from the Indian nations. They're the language of the American Indians. And we can see inside that Dakota area, there are 7 different nations. So we have the Sisseton, the Wahpeton, the Midewahkinton, the Wapakut. Those were all in Minnesota. Then out in the Dakotas, there was the Yankton, the Yankton, and even farther west is the Teton. So over on page 42 in that blue box, it talks about the 7 council fires of the Dakota. So if you saw in that circle, there were 7 different Dakota names that I read off. There are 7 bands within the Dakota nations, or the Oyate. The Dakota called these bands Ocheti Shakowi, the 7 council fires. Each council fire was named for the place where its people lived. The band spoke one of 3 dialects of the Dakota language: Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota. 6 of the 7 council fires still exist as organized groups. Only a few Dakota today consider themselves member of the Wapakut Council Fire. There are 4 official Dakota communities in Minnesota and reservations in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and in Canada. They also live in towns and cities throughout Minnesota and the upper Midwest. The Dakota have moved or been forced to move frequently over the past 200 years. Many have carried the traditions of their people with them wherever they have gone. So the Dakota is spiritual people who live by water, people who live in the forest, warriors who shoot from the leaves, and medicine people who live by water. Nakota are those scattered at the edge of the forest and people who live at the edge of the great forest. And the Lakota are the dwellers of the plains. So where those different nations or bands settled in the Dakota Nation, you can see what their name means, and it kind of explains where they were living. So now, page 44, people on the move. I want you to pay attention to some of the things that we're going to learn about in here because we're going to be doing a project next week based on this. So pay attention and we're going to learn about what we're going to be creating next week.
I have a song.
So people on the move. Life was well organized there in the teepee with a definite place for everybody. The members of the family had their own spaces where they habitually sat, ate, slept, and worked. Everyone kept his personal things in skin containers, which were always ornamental, sometimes handsomely. If something is done handsomely, it means it's beautiful, very well decorated. These were secured only as far as time strings could make them so. There were no locks and keys, but they were not missed. A good relative did not open another's things. Even small children were gently but firmly warned to leave things alone. Don't touch it if it's not yours. This is a good time to point out that we have had several items that have gone missing over the last couple of months. People have lost their water bottles, they've lost other items. Sometimes they turn back up, sometimes they're still missing. So it's important to remember that if it's not yours, don't take it. Pay attention. I know accidents happen. Sometimes things look like we're doing a lot of movement between classes and we might grab something that's someone else's. When you get home, check through your things. If you have a water bottle that's not yours, if you have a book or you have a marker, stuff that is not yours, bring it back to school because people are missing it. If you know whose it is, just give it back to them. If you're not sure whose it is, just put it on the back counter, either in my room or Mrs. Gregory's room. Okay? Make sure that you don't accidentally have other people's things. So just be mindful and careful as we're packing up our stuff that we're not accidentally taking somebody else's stuff. The Dakota were a people on the move. In springtime, certain bands went to sugar camps to tap maple trees and make sugar. They returned to permanent villages in the summer to grow crops. Those are the bark houses that we've talked about. Those permanent villages, that's where they grew their food. They had places set up to do their farming. They knew where the maple trees were because they're there every year all the time. They don't move. So that's where their permanent houses were. At the summer's end, some bands traveled to lakes to harvest rice. Throughout the fall, they were on the move hunting deer and bison. Even in the deepest snows of winter, the Dakotas sometimes moved camp to be closer to the wild animals they hunted in order to survive. So they needed to be in those teepees that were easy to take down and set up because if the bison moved, they had to be able to move. Otherwise, they would run out of food. So they had to be able to move with the deer and the bison so they could continue to have food all winter. What was it like to live a life on the move? How did the Dakota move camp and bring home heavy loads of meat? What did they use to store and carry things? On the next few pages are examples of containers, bags, and carrying packs made by Dakota within the last 200 years. You will also find accounts written by Dakota people and others who witnessed the traditional Dakota way of life. As you investigate these primary sources, try to imagine what life might have been like for the Dakotas centuries ago. If you had to carry everything you owned from place to place, what would you keep? What would you give up? Study the containers and bags on the next few pages and think about something you own that is important enough to carry from one home to another. What size and shape of container would best protect your most valuable possessions? So think about that. You only can possess things that you're able to carry with you from home to home. They had to move throughout the year. So they didn't have a lot of possessions. They didn't have a whole bedroom full of stuff. They only had the few things that they could carry on their person. So they had very limited possessions. Look at page 46, moving camp. In order to live close to food resources such as maple forest or ricing lakes, the Dakota had to pack and move their whole household. Dakota women owned the teepees and everything in them. Typically, women did the packing and moving. Moving camp was hard, especially during the winter. Starting at daybreak, women and children packed and carried heavy bundles through snow and icy water. If the streams were not frozen, if the streams were not frozen, they had to go through that icy water. The missionary Samuel Pond, who traveled with the Dakota in the early 1800s, never forgot what it was like to set up camp in winter. 14 teepee poles were to be found and dragged often a considerable distance through the snow, making 2 or 3 heavy loads for a strong woman. The tent was then erected, and dry grass cut up from some swamp was brought and put all around the teepee or all around the tent or teepee on the outside, for the Indian women would not bank their tents with snow lest it should melt and injure the tent. So they wanted to make sure on the bottom of the teepee they would put that grass, so that way the wet snow wouldn't wreck the skin, the teepee material that they used. Hay was also strewn inside to spread the beds on, for the frozen ground was hard and cold. Nobody wants to sleep on the frozen ground. So they put the straw down, that hay, to give it a little bit more warmth and make it a little more comfortable. Then wood was brought for the fire, very dry, for they burned no other. Last of all, water was brought and hung over the fire to warm or cook the supper, which by this time was well earned, if ever suppers are. So it was a lot of work. It was not easy to take down the teepees and to transport everything. Typically back then, the woman took care of the house. Nowadays, we're more equal. Men and women share the different roles in the houses, what comes easily for them. 200 years ago, life was different. So the woman took care of the house, the packing and the moving, and the men did the hunting. Now there's equal amounts of women and men go hunting. It's not seen as a male thing or a female thing. Back then it was very separated. Thankfully now we can do what we enjoy doing and what we're good at doing, and it doesn't depend on if you're a male or a female. After the hunt, Dakota men traveled great distances to hunt. Then wounded animals often led hunters even farther. After the hunt, the heavy work began. First, the hunters gave thanks for the many things the animal would provide to the people. Then they cut up the animal and carried it back to camp, often many miles. So think about how big the bison are. How many of us have seen a bison at the zoo or when we're driving out west? Yeah, a lot of us have seen bison. They are huge, way bigger than a cow. They're having to carry this animal back because they've already killed it. They're not walking it back. They're having to carry it back. Maybe they made a sled out of the wood and the skin that they could put it on, but they have to pull it miles. So think about how hard that is. The women are having to carry the sleds that have their teepees and all of their belongings on it. The men are having to carry all of these animals that they've hunted. It was not easy. They didn't have four-wheelers. They didn't have snowmobiles. They had to use their own muscles. So this was hard work. Hunters sometimes slipped and fell while carrying heavy loads through forests or swamps. If a hunter was injured or killed, his companions had to carry him home, no matter how far. After the men hunted bison in the snow, they cut them up and carried the meat home on sleds pulled by dogs. Ohiyesa, later known as Charles Eastman, recalled the extra challenges that hunters faced during the winter. Sleds were made of bison ribs and hickory saplings. The runners bound with rawhide with the hard side down. These slipped smoothly over the icy crust. Only the small men rode on the sleds. The men had their bows and arrows, and a few had guns. The huge animals could not run fast in the deep snow. The bison all followed a leader, trampling out a narrow path. The dogs, with their drivers, soon caught up with the bison on each side, and the hunters brought many of them down. I remember when the party returned late in the night. The men came in single file, well loaded, and each dog followed his master with an equally heavy load. Both men and animals were white with frost. It's the middle of the winter. They're out in that freezing cold. They have to go out and do the hunting. Otherwise, they won't have any food to eat. So they come back and they're frozen. Their hair is frozen. They're covered in frost. But they did what they had to do to help survive. This was not easy. It wasn't easy for the women doing their jobs. It wasn't easy for the men doing their jobs. Now the next page talks about the precious cargo. So look at that cradle board. That is what the babies were kept in. Of all the things carried, the most precious were their babies. Infants were very tenderly cared for, recalled Samuel Pond, a European American who lived among the Dakota people beginning in the 1830s. Dakota infants were kept on a wooden cradle board for most of their first year. They were wrapped in blankets and secured to their upright cradles by strips of cloth or hide. The infant faces were protected by a wooden frame, which was also used to hang toys and small objects to entertain the baby. According to Pond, nothing better than this cradle could have been contrived for the comfort and safety of the infants. There was no other way in which they could be carried on the frequent journeys with safety. So the babies were kept in these cradle boards for most of their first year. Every day they're strapped into these cradle boards, and that's what they're carried in. They're not carried in their arms. They weren't carried in blankets. They were carried in that cradle board. So it was very precious, a very special thing. Dakota containers. This is what we need to pay attention to. This is what we're going to be working on next week. The Dakota made many specialized containers like cradle boards to make packing and travel easier. Storage containers were made from materials available in the natural world. Different materials had different benefits. Bark containers were lightweight and held up well in wet and damp weather. Bags woven from reeds were easy to pack and could be dyed beautiful colors. Animal hides were readily available and made strong, waterproof containers. One kind of hide container was called a parfleche. That's what we're going to be doing. Parfleche containers were made from folded and painted rawhide, which was stiff and very strong. Parfleches were made in 4 basic shapes: a box, an envelope, a flat case, and a cylinder. Now it said from materials readily available. Animal skins are not readily available to us, so we are not going to make our parfleches out of animal hide. I am not going out and skinning animals to prepare for us to use next week.
I will.
Material that is readily available to us that has a similar look to that leathery look of the animal skin would be the brown paper bags. So we will be making our parfleches out of the brown paper bags, not animal hide. To make a parfleche, a woman began with a fresh hide from a bison, elk, or moose. She removed the fur and then scraped or fleshed the inside of the skin to remove the tissue and fat. That's not how I'm spending my weekend. Just saying. Next, she washed the skin, staked it down, and painted it with geometric designs using colors such as red, black, yellow, and green. So look at those different examples of the parfleches. Think about what geometric design you might want to put on your own parfleche. You can use your sketchbook to sketch out a geometric design. This isn't creating a pretty picture with butterflies and flowers and hearts. It's a geometric design, meaning you use shapes, triangles, squares, diamonds. Okay, think about those different shapes that we are seeing on these pictures. We want to create a geometric design that we could decorate our parfleche with. We will get specific instructions on the parfleche next week. Okay, so we're not going over details of the parfleche, but I do want you considering what you want to put on it, what type of design you want to use. And we're going to go over how we're going to create it next week. But start thinking about designs that you could make. With that, we are going to say goodbye to our friends listening at home. And we're going to hope our friends at home are going to be considering what type of designs they want to use for their own parfleches.